Have you ever heard of people who simply disappear, as if erased from reality? Well, get ready. This story will challenge everything you believe about time, space, and truth. Elias Monroe was an ordinary man with a simple life and a generous heart. That morning he left home just to buy bread, 3 blocks away, a routine he followed every day without fail, but that day he never returned. No witnesses, no traces, no clue. He vanished as if swallowed by the air itself. What happened next left the police, the community, and even international experts perplexed. 40 years of absolute silence. 40. And when everyone had given up hope, he reappeared. In the same place, in the same way, wearing the same clothes, and most unbelievable, almost without aging. As if time for him had stopped, or simply followed a different logic. This story isn't just about a disappearance. It's about what exists in the cracks of reality. It's about love, fear, hope, emotional intelligence, and a secret he refuses to share to this day. If you think you've seen it all, wait until you learn the details of this case, but be careful, because after that, you may never look at reality the same way again. On that foggy morning, typical of a quiet little town in rural Pennsylvania, everything seemed completely normal. The sun was still yawning behind the clouds, while the smell of fresh coffee wafted through the quiet streets. His name was Elias Monroe, a simple, soft-spoken man with a generous heart and an eye always attentive to life's small beauties. He left the house in his faded brown coat, waved to his neighbor with his usual kindness, and headed for the bakery, as he had done every morning for over 20 years. He carried neither a cell phone nor a wallet, just a few coins in his pocket, and the custom of always greeting each person with respect and affection. But that morning something different was in the air. The neighborhood dogs were restless, the tree branches seemed to point in an invisible direction, and even the sound of birds was silent. It was the last time anyone saw Elias. No security. Cameras recorded his journey. No bakery employee remembered serving him. The baker swore he hadn't received any customers at that hour. It was as if Elias had been swallowed by the ground itself. The family fell into despair. His wife, Laura, a woman of strength, known for her perseverance and wisdom, went door to door, searching for clues, begging for any information, no matter how insignificant. The pain of loneliness began to mix with fear, and insecurity spread like a fog in the heart of that home. The children tried to keep hope alive, clinging to faith, memory, and gratitude for every moment spent with their father. That close-knit community mobilized selflessly, forming search parties, organizing vigils, and raising posters with Elias's smiling face. Theories, rumors, and legends arose. Some said he had fled of his own free will, but those who knew him knew of his love for his family, his unwavering honesty, and his courage to weather any storm. Despite their initial commitment, authorities soon began treating the case as an unsolved mystery, and as time passed, Elias's name faded into a whisper, but the void he left behind continued to scream within those who loved him deeply. It was as if the world had decided to tear him away violently, without permission, without warning, for no apparent reason. The most intriguing thing was the feeling that there was something beyond what met the eye. That abrupt absence carried a different atmosphere, as if it were not just a disappearance but a rupture, a silent break in the logic of things, as if someone had tampered with the invisible gears of reality. Neighborhood stories began to include terms like parallel dimension, abduction, temporal phenomenon, but even with so much speculation, what was most striking was the feeling of empathy that spread through those who heard the story. Elias's disappearance wasn't just the disappearance of a man, but the collapse of a routine, the impact of an absence that seemed to carry an unfathomable secret. The pain of loss was tempered by tireless hope, by faith in reconciliation, by the understanding That some answers require time, courage, and emotional intelligence to be absorbed. What if the world were in fact more complex than we imagine? What if, on that simple trip to the bakery, Elias had taken the first step toward a journey that would defy the laws of reason? The truth, for now, remained shrouded like a thick fog, ready to dissipate at the precise moment the next fragment of the enigma emerged. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks dragged on into months, a new theory began to gain traction among residents, investigators, and even Elias's family. The possibility of a carefully orchestrated kidnapping. The idea sounded uncomfortable but plausible. After all, how could someone disappear in broad daylight, just 3 blocks away without a trace? The questions multiplied like a plague of doubts, fueling fear and a sense of vulnerability. Why would anyone choose Elias? A seemingly ordinary man with no debts, no enemies, no involvement in anything shady. His life was governed by simplicity, honesty, and a serene routine. But perhaps, precisely for that reason, he was the perfect target. Someone invisible to society, who wouldn't arouse suspicion or trigger immediate alarms. The idea of a silent kidnapping shook the perception of security and challenged even trust in social structures. Laura, Elias's wife, refused to believe he had been just another statistic of violence or silent injustice. With the firmness of someone who loves deeply, she hired private investigators, sought guidance from security experts, and even ventured into obscure internet forums where similar cases were discussed with astonishing coldness. Amidst wild theories and improbable speculations, stories emerged of people who had been taken by clandestine organizations, often to serve as guinea pigs in secret experiments or as blackmail in plots more complex than any movie script. With each new piece of information, a thread of hope was reborn, sustained by a faith fueled by compassion, hope, and emotional intelligence. It wasn't just about rescuing a missing man, but about fighting for truth, justice, and reconciliation between what one believes and what one lives. Among the investigators, one detail began to draw attention: the strange calm surrounding the case. No witnesses, no clues, no bank transactions, no suspicious connections. It was as if the kidnapper, if there was one, had operated with supernatural acumen. A surgical act, clean, silent, where the absence of traces was, in itself, the greatest evidence. What if it was someone with privileged access to information, someone trained, someone powerful enough to manipulate all the records? The idea seemed straight out of a John Grisham novel, but the real pain of a broken family demanded practical answers, not just speculation. For Elias's children, each new line of investigation was a mixture of hope and torment. Hope of finding their father alive, and torment of imagining what condition he might be in. What if he was being held captive, forced to live a life of submission and fear, while out here life went on as if he had never existed? This thought gnawed at Laura's heart, but also strengthened her. Because love, when combined with courage and perseverance, has the power to move worlds, and she was willing to go all the way, even if it meant facing invisible, unknown, and frighteningly silent forces. Once, a silver-haired woman with a distant gaze approached Laura in a downtown cafe. In a low voice, almost as if afraid her own thoughts might be overheard, she said, "Maybe he wasn't taken. Maybe he just crossed over." And before Laura could react, the woman added, "Have you ever heard of the old railroad crossing?" It seemed absurd at first, but it aroused a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. The crossing was known among the ancients as a place where time seemed to slow down, where the winds turned in reverse and compasses lost track of north. Many claimed to experience dizziness, chills, and even memory lapses upon crossing that point. Some spoke of sourceless whispers. Others swore they saw pulsating lights, nebulous figures, or figures that disappeared in the blink of an eye. All of this, of course, was treated as legend, local folklore, stories to entertain grandchildren on cold nights. But that woman's words hovered over Laura like a seed planted with intention. What if Elijah had, in fact, crossed an invisible threshold? Gradually, the portal theory began to gain traction among the more sensitive, among those who saw beyond the visible and believed that the universe is vaster than our logic can grasp. An elderly librarian, known for his intelligence, humility, and his collection of rare manuscripts, showed Laura an old map of the city, dated 1891. On it, the crossroads of the old railroad line were marked with esoteric symbols and a handwritten note, point of confluence. He spoke of energy lines, wormholes, and interdimensional passages that, for brief moments, open in specific locations. The man, with all his wisdom and serenity, didn't try to convince Laura, simply shared what he saw as if offering a ray of hope. She, in turn, felt the power of inspiration reborn. The possibility that Elijah had crossed over to another reality, where time flows differently, where the rules are different, was frightening, but it brought with it a new strand of faith, understanding, and a desire to move forward. Driven by this new hope, Laura decided to visit the place. It was a grey morning, the sky covered in heavy clouds. She walked to the crossroads as if treading on sacred ground. There, surrounded by ancient shrubs and moss-covered stones, she felt a cold wind touch her face, even though there was no visible breeze. Her steps slowed. The sound of cars seemed to have vanished. The very air seemed to vibrate. Suddenly, she was overcome by a strong sense of affection, as if Elijah were there, very close. She closed her eyes and remained still for a few minutes. When she opened them, nothing had changed, or perhaps everything. It was impossible to explain, but her intuition screamed that there was something there that defied logic. The experience left her stronger, more connected to the possibility of a greater truth. What if Elijah were in a place where time runs, in circles, where 40 years could fit in the blink of an eye? These questions still had no answers, but they already laid the groundwork for a new stage of the journey. A stage where the improbable began to seem possible. Rumors began to circulate more strongly after a young investigator newly arrived in town decided to reopen Elias's case on his own. Motivated by a strong sense of justice and a curiosity fueled by intelligence and courage, he began analyzing old reports, forgotten files, and ignored testimonies. Amidst so much neglected material, a hypothesis began to take shape. What if Elias had been held captive all this time? Not just any captivity, but an intentional, meticulously planned confinement in a place as hidden as it was inhospitable. The idea stirred the deepest instinct of indignation. There was something profoundly cruel and inhumane about it. Imagining Elias, a man with a kind soul, with a heart driven by kindness and altruism, imprisoned alone, perhaps in absolute silence, was a difficult blow to bear. Who would do this? For what purpose would someone keep another human being in complete isolation for so long, without ever asking for a ransom or making demands? Among the hypotheses raised were secret government projects, clandestine psychological experiments, and even shadowy cults that kidnapped people for inexplicable purposes. Nothing was concrete, but the evidence piled up like pieces of a crooked puzzle. A man living on the outskirts of the forest once reported hearing muffled screams coming from a sealed cave. Another, hiking in the mountains, swore he saw a man identical to Elias being dragged away by hooded figures. The stories, though seemingly fanciful, carried enough emotion to ignite the investigation. The dark captivity could have been physical, but perhaps also psychological. What if instead of chains they had used manipulation? What if Elias had been kept under control through fear, misinformation, the systematic shattering of his identity? The concept of freedom gains new layers when one realizes how much the human mind can be dominated without realizing it. Laura, considering this line of thought, felt a mixture of anger, compassion, and determination. The love she felt for Elias now also fueled her to overcome that abyss. Many of the possible answers to this captivity pointed to something greater, something that transcended mere human evil. Were they occult institutions, organizations with cutting-edge technology and unlimited resources, or was it the work of an isolated mind driven by obsession and emotional imbalance? A woman named Evelyn, a retired forensic psychologist, shared a frightening theory with Laura. According to her, there was a pattern to disappearances like Elias's, all involving people considered ordinary, but who possessed some kind of intuitive wisdom, a rare emotional intelligence. People who, for some reason, instilled fear in certain silent elites. This would explain why Elias had been kept from the world for so long. Fear of his humanity, fear of his light, fear of what he might inspire in people. This theory transformed the kidnapping into something more symbolic, an attack not just on a life, but on the very idea of humanity, on kindness, on empathy, on integrity. And perhaps between the lines of this suspicion lay the key to an unexpected return and to revelations that were not yet ready to be accepted. One night, around the Monroe family's old fireplace, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. The children, now adults, pored over photo albums, searching for clues they had never noticed before. That was when one of them, Daniel, dared to say aloud something no one had the courage to consider. What if he was never taken? What if he wanted to disappear? The sentence struck like a bolt of lightning, splitting the air with a suffocating intensity. That possibility seemed to betray Elias's memory. How could someone so upright, so devoted, have abandoned everything, willingly? But as the idea was debated, a thread of understanding began to unravel. Perhaps indeed there was something Elias carried in the silence of his chest. A pain, a frustration, an unspoken desire to escape. People often judge abandonment harshly, but ignore the weight many carry in secret. What if he was simply tired? Tired of being strong, tired of giving so much without receiving the same in return, tired of smiling to hide his own ruins. A neighbor one day mentioned that he had seen Elias talking to a stranger days before his disappearance. A well-dressed man with a foreign accent and a firm gaze. According to the report, Elias seemed shaken but determined. This memory rekindled the theory that he had voluntarily become involved in something greater than himself. A mission, a pact, an unthinkable choice. What if he had been recruited by an international organization, a secret society, or a silent front fighting injustice operating in the shadows? It may sound like a conspiracy theory, but history is full of ordinary men who, in decisive moments, take on extraordinary roles. Perhaps Elias was one of them. What if at that moment he decided to renounce his identity to live a new life in another country, under another name, driven by a noble cause or a secret that could never be revealed? The truth in this case wouldn't make him a traitor, but rather someone who made a sacrifice, a rare kind of altruism that few would be able to understand, much less accept. But the question that tormented Laura and her children wasn't just why he disappeared, but why he decided to return 40 years later. And why now? Time doesn't forgive absences. People change, houses age, streets take on new colors. Yet there was something in Elias's expression when he returned that didn't match someone who had simply fled. His gaze carried layers of pain, fear, and repressed love. As if he wanted to say that, no matter how far he'd left, he'd never stopped being there. Time hadn't aged him like others, but loneliness had shaped him with invisible marks. Forgiveness at this point became a difficult but necessary process, and perhaps the greatest proof of humanity was accepting that, yes, even the most upright can falter, that even heroes sometimes choose dark paths in search of redemption. The possibility that Elias had lived a parallel life, with new friends, a different routine, and different loves, became not a condemnation, but fertile ground for reconciliation. Because even broken hearts still beat, and even the most controversial choices can carry seeds of compassion and wisdom. Elias's return was anything but ordinary. He appeared as if he had never left, on the same sidewalk where he had last been seen, with the same brown coat, the same haircut, even the same worn shoes. But what was most shocking wasn't his reappearance itself. It was his appearance. 40 years had passed for everyone except him. While his friends were white-haired, bent over by time, Elias seemed to have aged no more than 2 years. The shock spread like wildfire. Doctors rushed to run tests. Journalists tried to break into the property. Scientists were consulted. Nothing made sense, no biological explanation, no plausible justification. Elias said only one thing, in the calm voice of someone who had seen too much. "Where I've been, time flows differently," and when asked where that place was, he simply closed his eyes and sighed. There was emotion in his every gesture, as if the whole world were out of place. In the community, the rumor of temporal suspension exploded, like a secret that could no longer be hidden. People began revisiting the old portal theory, now from the perspective of a temporal anomaly. Experts in theoretical physics came forward with graphs, formulas, and almost literary possibilities. They spoke of wormholes, alternative gravitational fields, even cosmic interference. But the truth is, nothing explained what their eyes saw so clearly. Elias wasn't just intact, he carried a different energy. It was as if time had respected him, and in the midst of all this, the most profound reflection of all emerged. What is time, after all? A clock, a calendar, or an emotional construct that forces us to move forward, even when we're not ready? Elias's story inspired not only scientists but poets, philosophers, and artists, because it touched on something universal, the struggle between the fear of the unknown and the hope of something greater, the possibility that love, faith, and intelligence exist even in the invisible cracks of reality. Laura, who now had wrinkles on her face and silver hair, but maintained the same tenderness in her eyes, welcomed him with a hug that lasted longer than any explanation. Deep down, she knew she didn't need to understand. She just needed to feel. And when she looked at him, she saw that the man she loved was still there. Different, yes. Mysterious, certainly. But the same in essence. Elias spoke of places where the sky changed color according to emotions, of infinite rooms full of mirrors that showed possible versions of oneself, of people who seemed made of light. But he spoke with the insecurity of someone unsure if he was delirious or if it was all real. Sometimes he got lost in his own thoughts, as if still between dimensions. Laura's emotional intelligence was what kept him grounded, the understanding that their reunion was also a new beginning, and that perhaps, for him, nothing had passed, but for her, the world had changed. And at that point, a new mystery arose which would lead everyone to question whether that time travel had not left much deeper marks than could be seen. It was on the third night after Elias's return that Laura noticed something unusual while helping him change his clothes. Lifting his shirt, she saw scars unlike any other she knew. They weren't simple cuts or accident marks. They were symbols, precisely engraved, as if someone or something had made them for a specific purpose. They were spirals, interspersed triangles, shapes that seemed to move when observed for too long. Elias flinched at Laura's frightened look. He simply said he woke up to it without knowing when or how. During medical examinations, experts classified the marks as unusual scars of unknown origin, but avoided speculation. Symbology scholars, however, stated that some of the marks resembled inscriptions found in ancient civilizations, such as the Sumerians and Mayans. Others believed they were highly complex mathematical codes. Some even said they were compressed formulas, perhaps information engraved directly on Elias's body. The mystery deepened, provoking fear, fascination, and a new series of theories. Some residents began to avoid Elias. What had once been a feeling of warmth and welcome gave way to suspicion. Some said he was no longer human, that he had returned, different, contaminated. A more radical religious group even accused him of making a pact with dark forces. But Laura, always driven by empathy and sincerity, defended Elias with the strength of someone who loves unconditionally. She knew those marks didn't define him. Whether they were the result of scientific experiments, unknown rituals, or otherworldly technologies, it didn't matter. What mattered was the essence of that man. And there he was, with the same sweet look in his eyes, the same honesty, the same silent way of showing affection. The scars might even carry hidden meanings, but they were also silent witnesses to an experience he didn't yet know how to verbalize. Elias's courage lay in existing in the face of absurdity, without ready explanations, and still trying to rebuild a life. There was, however, one particularly strange moment. A visiting scientist, an expert in advanced cryptography, observed the marks with a scanner that responded to frequency emissions. To everyone's astonishment, the scars emitted a faint magnetic pulsation pattern, as if they weren't just scars but transmitters. Devices, living archives, portals. No one knew for sure, but that changed the tone of the investigation. The hypothesis that Elias had been part of an advanced experiment, perhaps not human, gained traction, and even without answers, he began to report vivid dreams, fragmented memories of cold rooms, metallic instruments, voices that spoke without moving their lips. Fear grew, but with it, so did a sense of perseverance. Laura, determined, began seeking help beyond the boundaries of traditional science. She contacted consciousness scholars, regression therapists, and cellular memory experts. If they couldn't erase the scars, perhaps they could discover what they wanted to reveal, because deep down, he sensed that Elias carried not just a secret, but a key, and that key, still locked, might open a door no one had ever dared to cross. As the days passed, Elias showed clear signs of a mind split in two. He was no longer the same, and not just on the outside. His memories seemed shrouded in a thick fog, as if they had been pushed to the bottom of an emotional ocean, a place only reached by diving with courage and resilience. Sometimes he would wake up startled in a cold sweat, mumbling words in languages he didn't understand. At other times, he would sit on the balcony and describe in unsettling detail cities, suspended in the air, endless corridors filled with mirrors, beings of light who spoke with their eyes and taught him things he couldn't translate. But minutes later, he remembered nothing. It was as if his own memory had been edited, cut, censored. Doctors called it dissociative amnesia. Spiritualists said it was the soul protecting itself. But Laura sensed there was more. Something there escaped common understanding. It was as if Elias were torn between two worlds, here where time is linear and cruel, and there where time dances to the rhythm of the heart. Little by little, clues began to emerge. One night, while leafing through an old geographical atlas, Elias pointed to a spot on the map that didn't exist. "There. That's where I was," he said quietly. When questioned, he couldn't explain the name, but he described a city of spiraling towers full of hanging gardens and fountains that sang their own melodies. He spoke as if remembering a dream that keeps slipping through his fingers. Another time, watching a documentary about galaxies, he was transfixed by an image of Orion's belt. His eyes filled with tears. He whispered something like it was near there. Still, when asked minutes later, he didn't know what they were talking about. It was as if memories surfaced like flashes and then faded, leaving a trail of anguish. The family faced a challenge, respecting their boundaries with love and understanding without pressure, while simultaneously trying to recover the fragments that emerged. Elias wasn't just trying to remember. He was fighting an invisible barrier erected within himself. With the support of a therapist specializing in extreme trauma, they began guided regression sessions. These were delicate experiences, filled with tears and silence. In one session, Elias spoke of a silence laboratory, a cold place where he was constantly observed. In another, he described a white space where he floated without feeling his body. He spoke of voices that came not from outside, but from within, telling him to forget, not to tell, to protect something greater. It was clear that this wasn't just amnesia. It was a kind of intentional blockage, and this further deepened the mystery. What did he know that he couldn't remember? What was shown to him that his mind couldn't bear to hold? The therapist's compassion, combined with Laura's emotional intelligence and the children's initiative, created an environment of acceptance and trust. Because they knew that memories cannot be forced. They must be respected, like the scars on the heart. Little by little, the link between the memories strengthened, and the truth seemed ever closer. A truth that, as he had said, might not be understood, but it would be revealed. One piece at a time. It was hard to believe, but the facts were all there, stark and raw. Elias had returned to the exact same spot where he disappeared 40 years earlier. A detail that escaped common sense, but which, for the most attentive, carried profound symbolism. He didn't just return to the city. He reappeared on the same stretch of sidewalk, on the corner between the bakery and the newsstand, as if he had simply taken a step forward and crossed decades in a second. That corner, now transformed into a kind of silent sanctuary, took on the air of a sacred place. Flowers, candles, notes and prayers began to be left there by strangers and acquaintances, some out of empathy, others out of pure curiosity. Most surprising was that, at that very moment Elias reappeared, the city's clocks went 3 minutes slower without explanation. No electrical failure, no interference. It was as if time had, for a brief moment, stopped to welcome him. His return to the same place added a new layer of complexity to the mystery. Was the place an entry point, a door, or was Elias the portal itself, carrying within him a connection between two realities? For Elias, time had not passed. It was as if he had taken a single step, an instant, a blink of an eye. He didn't remember having crossed days, months, years. In his perception, he had merely walked toward the bakery, and the next instant, he was surrounded by aged faces, modern cars, and posters with his face plastered on the walls. The city had changed, but he hadn't. To others, 4 decades had passed. To him, it seemed as if only the wind had changed direction. This temporal disconnection created an almost unbearable emotional abyss. Friends had died. His children now. Adults were older than he. Laura, even with a heart full of love, now faced the difficult task of loving a man who had never known grief. He didn't know the pain he had caused. He didn't feel his absence. And this demanded a superhuman level of understanding and generosity from her. Reconciling what had been experienced and what had been lost became the true challenge. Because returning to the same place wasn't just physical, It was emotional, psychological, spiritual. And each step from then on needed to be taken with the delicacy of someone carrying crystals in their pocket. Among the neighbors, some began to question, why right there? Why return to the exact starting point? A quantum theorist at the local university suggested that the physical space where Elias returned possessed a specific frequency, a kind of invisible coordinate that aligns only at rare moments. An elderly woman, known for her mystical sensitivity, said that the place had held space for him. But there were also those who said this was all symbolic, that life does indeed push us to the same point until we understand the lesson it has taught us. Perhaps Elias had returned not by chance, but because there was still something to say, something to live, something to reveal. Returning to the same place, therefore, was not the end of the mystery. It was the harbinger of an even greater revelation, kept under lock and key, lodged in the silences of his mind. And in those tired eyes which now observed the city with a mixture of tenderness and wonder, there was something that insisted on saying, without words, that the most important thing had not yet been said. Even after countless questions, interviews, therapy sessions, and his family's sincere attempts to understand his journey, Elias maintained an impenetrable veil over a part of his story. When pressed, his eyes would avert eye contact. His expression would change, and he would simply repeat, "You wouldn't understand, and if you knew, you wouldn't sleep soundly." The phrase, spoken calmly, without a threatening tone, was more powerful than any shout. It was as if he carried within himself a truth so colossal that the mere act of verbalizing it could tear the fragile fabric of reality. This refusal wasn't out of arrogance, but out of empathy. Elias didn't want to cause pain. It was as if the secret carried its own weight, an emotional density so great that exposing it would be like spreading black ink on a clear lake. The wisdom in his eyes was silent, like that of someone who has seen the other side of things and returned changed. There was the serenity in him of someone who understood something about the world and about humanity that others weren't yet ready to hear. Laura, with all the compassion that a lifetime of love can build, respected this silence. Not out of conformity, but out of wisdom. She understood that not everything needs to be said to be felt. Her children, on the other hand, were torn between curiosity and frustration. It was difficult to accept that, after so much suffering, they wouldn't have the answers they sought. Still, they learned over time that truth is sometimes a seed that needs to mature in silence before blossoming. Some believed Elias had been part of an experiment that surpassed human understanding. Others swore he had access to higher dimensions, where he understood things about the soul, time, and existence. There were even those who said he knew the exact moment of death, not his own, but of humanity as we know it, and therefore chose not to tell. His silence in this case was a form of kindness, a form of protection, because there are secrets that are kept not out of fear, but out of altruism. And Elias seemed to have made this choice consciously, an act of emotional intelligence and the power of kindness. But there was something more. On the rare occasions when he spoke encryptically, he left clues unspoken. They are here, but not in the way we think. Or even, it's not about where I've been, but about what I saw inside myself. These phrases echoed in the minds of those who listened attentively. They seemed to contain codes, seeds of a greater truth. Perhaps the message wasn't in the words he spoke, but between the lines, in the tone of his voice, in the restrained gleam in his eyes, in the trembling of his hands when the wind shifted. Elias didn't need to reveal his secret. He was alive in his presence, in every silent gesture, in every pause filled with emotion. In every moment, he gazed at the horizon with the expression of someone who had been on the other side. And so, even without revealing everything, he inspired. He inspired courage, hope, perseverance, It showed that sometimes the greatest revelation isn't in the answer, but in the question it forces us to ask. And who knows, perhaps right at this point where the story seems to end, lies the true beginning of what still needs to be understood. And now, after everything you've heard, tell me, do you really know the people around you? Do you truly understand the silences of those you love? How many Elijahs have you let slip by, trapped in an invisible routine, screaming inside while the world calls them normal? What if time wasn't what you imagined? What if life has been trying to tell you something for years, but you're too busy chasing empty promises? Elijah's disappearance isn't just a riddle, it's a mirror. It forces us to face the unknown within ourselves, to reflect on the paths not taken, the invisible portals that open when we have the courage to question. And you? Have you been listening to the signs? Have you been paying attention to the synchronicities, the details, the moments of silence that carry more truth than 1,000 words? The real question here isn't where Elijah was. The question is, where are you now? Because perhaps the true disappearance is that of those who stopped living with purpose. If this story touched you in any way, made you think, feel, or simply stirred something deep inside, then share it. Comment below what you think happened to Elias, and most importantly, what would you do in his place? Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and stay with us, because here each story is a key, and you have no idea what lies ahead.